He was the CEO of a cold company. She was the secretary who brought warmth. When Helen Whitaker lost both her mother and her job in the same year, she wasn't looking to be seen. She was looking to disappear. She found work in a gray, silent office where birthdays were ignored. Voices were low, and no one dared speak to the man at the top. Thomas Granger. 42, brilliant, respected, and entirely alone, until Helen, with quiet hands and handwritten notes, started changing the building one cup of tea, one kind word, one human moment at a time. But when someone from the inside accused her of manipulation, Thomas had to make a choice: protect his title or the woman who made him feel human again. What would you choose if your heart finally woke up, just as the world told you to shut it down? This isn't just a love story. It's a story of healing, of standing up, of remembering who we are beneath the roles we play. If this touched something in you, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Now, take a breath, and let me tell you a story. After losing her mother and her job in the same year, Helen wasn't looking for hope anymore. Just silence and a place to disappear. Helen Whitaker didn't move to Vermont for a fresh start. She moved because it was the only place quiet enough to grieve in peace. After 20 years in a city that never slept, first as a student, then a teacher, then a full-time caregiver, Helen had come to realize something simple and terrible. There are some losses no one prepares you for. Her mother's passing was slow, not in time, but in spirit. The kind of slow that eats away at the days. The kind of slow that steals someone's voice long before it takes their breath. And when the last of the machines stopped humming, silence followed her home like a ghost. She tried to return to teaching after the funeral, but the classroom felt different. Her words didn't come the way they used to. The spark in her eyes, what her students had once called the Helen magic, flickered out. She resigned without fanfare. No goodbye party. No last lecture. Just a plain white envelope slipped under the principal's door. She found the ad for the job on a local board. Administrative assistant, full-time Granger and Sons Foods, Middlefield. VT seeking someone organized, discreet, and dependable. 3 words that sounded like her, or at least what was left of her. Vermont wasn't on her list, but something about the name Middlefield felt gentle, like a town that had known how to breathe long before the rest of the world remembered. Helen packed 2 suitcases, sold the rest, and drove north in her rusted-out Corolla. The fall leaves were just turning. Amber, crimson, ochre colors that felt too alive for her grayness, but she watched them anyway. There was comfort in their surrender. The office of Granger and Sons Foods sat in a red brick building on a quiet street just past the town square. It was once the family home of the company's founder, converted into offices sometime in the late 80s. Ivy crawled up its southern wall, and a wooden sign hung just above the steps, hand-carved, built with care, grown with integrity. Inside, the place still smelled faintly of wood polish and something sweet, maybe cinnamon or memory. Her interview was short. The HR manager, Edith, was kind in the way older women often are, with eyes that read too much, but lips that judged nothing. "You're overqualified," she had said gently, "but you look like someone who needs this job for reasons that aren't about money." Helen didn't respond, just nodded. Sometimes silence said enough. Her first day came with no welcome, no company tour, no team lunch, just a laminated badge, a desk near the back, and a stack of outdated manuals. No one asked where she came from. No one offered small talk at the coffee machine. No one even seemed to notice she existed, And for now, she liked it that way. She organized her drawers with quiet precision, labeled folders no one asked her to, cleaned the dusty corner of the break room because no one else had. She took her lunch alone, watching the wind brush through the trees just outside the window. There was a rhythm to invisibility that felt oddly comforting. Until the day the door opened and he walked in. Thomas Granger. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. You could tell who he was by the way everyone sat up straighter. The way voices dimmed, as if the very air had tightened its tie. He moved like a man used to rooms falling quiet at his entrance. Tall, impeccably dressed, eyes sharp enough to cut marble, and a kind of stillness about him like a lake that's frozen solid just beneath the surface. Helen happened to be placing papers in the conference room when he entered. Their eyes didn't meet. In fact, he didn't look at her at all. He simply took his seat at the head of the table, opened a silver pen, and began writing in the margins of a thick report. Not a glance, not a nod, not a breath of acknowledgement, but somehow she felt seen anyway, and not in a good way. The meeting began. She wasn't invited to stay. She slipped out silently, but not before catching a glimpse of the name etched into the leather portfolio in front of him. Thomas A. Granger, CEO. So this was the man behind the policy changes, the one who had quietly stripped birthdays from the calendar, removed the Friday lunches, turned the once bustling employee lounge into a forgotten storage room. A man of numbers. They called him efficient, ruthless, brilliant, cold. Helen returned to her desk, the echo of that silent room still pressing on her skin like frost. She had dealt with cold before. She'd buried warmth with her mother. She could handle this too. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man who hadn't looked at her would become the one who couldn't stop. That in the sterile silence of that first meeting room. She had just met the man who would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and love. It wasn't just the fluorescent lights or the beige walls. It was the silence, the kind that comes when people stop believing they matter. The silence at Granger and Sons wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that hummed under bad lighting, clung to the edges of beige walls, and settled into the space between every forced smile. Helen noticed it by her third day. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of something more vital. Laughter, curiosity, spontaneity. The kind of things that once made a workplace feel alive. Here, footsteps were measured. Conversations were functional. No one lingered at the copier, and no one ever asked how your weekend was. At 8:58 a.m., employees shuffled in. At 5:01 p.m., they vanished like smoke. Lunches were eaten at desks, alone. Phones scrolled through silently. Emails clicked through like clockwork. Even the coffee pot seemed ashamed of its weak brew. Helen, seated at her modest corner desk, started to pick up on the rhythm. There was no birthday calendar on the wall, no faded Polaroids from company picnics, no team bulletin board. She asked Edith gently, one afternoon, did the office ever do group lunches or celebrations? The older woman paused, stirring her tea slowly. We used to. Mr. Granger, the senior one, he believed people worked better when they felt seen. But things changed. The pause that followed didn't need filling. Helen understood. She soon learned that the biggest change came about a year ago, right after Thomas Granger took the reins. Where his grandfather had led with heart, he led with metrics, efficiency, productivity, measurable results. Out went the Friday lunches, out went the wellness breaks, out went the annual holiday party that everyone, especially Edith, once looked forward to. And with them, slowly, went something else warmth. Helen didn't complain. She had come here to disappear, not make waves. Still, her teacher's heart kept noticing things. How Mason Young, eager, maybe 20 at most, walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing for dismissal. How Frank, the warehouse driver, always looked down when passing by, though his weathered face suggested a man who once laughed a lot. How even the artificial plants in the lobby seemed tired. It wasn't burnout she saw. It was quiet resignation, as if the people had stopped expecting to matter. The moment that changed everything came on a gray Thursday afternoon. Helen had gone to the break room, more a glorified closet to warm up leftover soup. Mason was there, nervously fiddling with a jammed vending machine. He gave her a quick, awkward nod and kept his head down. The machine coughed and clicked, refusing to give up the granola bar he'd clearly already paid for. Helen watched for a moment, then gently said, "Try lifting the front edge slightly before you press again." He blinked. "Oh, okay." The trick worked. The bar dropped. He gave a tiny smile, grateful. But before he could say anything more, 2 senior staff walked in, chatting. They didn't greet either of them. One of them, a man Helen had seen in meetings with Thomas, looked at Mason and said loudly, as if he weren't even there, "I still don't get why we're spending budget on interns. Half of them don't even know how to operate a coffee machine." The other laughed flatly, not even glancing in Mason's direction. Helen's eyes shifted to Mason. His face flushed instantly, red spreading across his cheeks like a spill. He looked down, gripping the bar tightly, then turned and left without a word. She followed him back into the hallway, but didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse, but the way he rubbed his eyes with his sleeve quickly, hoping no one saw, told her everything. He wasn't just embarrassed, he was hurt. Not because he'd made a mistake, but because he wasn't even allowed the dignity of being spoken to as a person. That night, Helen couldn't stop thinking about it. She remembered what it felt like to feel invisible, to be useful but unseen, present but untouchable. It was how she felt those last months in the hospital, as the nurses whispered updates over her head, not to her, as if her presence, her care was incidental. She had survived that silence once. But now, watching a boy half her age crumple under the weight of the same emptiness, something in her stirred. Not rage, not defiance, but something quieter, something steady, something that began like the warmth of a kettle just starting to hum. A need not to change the world, but maybe just one corner of it. She returned to her desk the next morning and looked around. The same beige walls, the same silence, the same lack of color. But in her drawer was a post-it pad, and in her heart, a decision not yet fully formed, but already quietly growing roots. She had seen enough, and something inside her, something quiet but persistent, began to stir. They called him the iceberg, silent, sharp, and impossible to move. Thomas Granger didn't care much for nicknames, but if he knew they called him the iceberg behind closed doors, he might not have been surprised. He was used to the chill, not because he enjoyed being distant, but because he learned early that warmth was costly, that letting people get too close meant giving them a map to your weak spots. And maps, he knew, always came with risk. He grew up in boardrooms more than backyards. While other boys were learning how to pitch baseballs, Thomas was learning how to read profit and loss sheets over breakfast with his father. His mother, polite and porcelain, was more interested in fundraising galas than in bedtime stories. And his grandfather, William Granger, the legendary founder of Granger and Sons, was the only adult who ever looked him in the eye as if he truly mattered. William taught him how to knead dough by hand before teaching him how to manage a balance sheet. He taught him how to speak to people, not at them. But somewhere along the way, Those lessons became buried beneath layers of expectation, of legacy, of distance. Thomas excelled in school, graduated top of his class, and landed a job on Wall Street before he was 25. He built a name for himself in mergers and acquisitions, known for his clean-cut precision and ruthless logic. Emotion. That was for poets, and poetry didn't grow stock portfolios. When his grandfather died, Thomas returned not because he wanted to, but because it was expected. He thought he'd be back in the city within a year. Fix the company, streamline operations, make it competitive. Instead, the small town kept holding on to him like an old coat that still smelled like home. By the time Helen joined the company, Thomas had been CEO for 11 months. He had replaced 3 department heads, cut expenses by 20%, introduced quarterly KPIs for every team. He didn't see the point of monthly birthday cakes or employee appreciation walls. They weren't efficient. They didn't impact bottom lines. They were relics of a softer time, a time his grandfather clung to. Even when margins tightened, Thomas believed in numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't falter. They didn't disappoint. People, on the other hand, did. Helen barely saw Thomas outside of meetings. His schedule was always packed. His door was rarely open. If he passed her desk, it was with a polite nod, at most never unkind, never warm. But one evening, as she stayed late organizing old files, she stepped into the hallway toward the executive wing. The office lights had dimmed to their after-hours glow, and the building had settled into its evening stillness. That's when she saw him. He stood alone in front of the company's founder wall, a gallery of framed photos chronicling the evolution of Granger and Sons. And at the center was a black-and-white portrait of William Granger's strong jaw, soft eyes, flour-dusted apron. Thomas didn't speak, didn't move, didn't know anyone was there. He just stood there, looking, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes tracing the lines of the only man who had ever seen him as more than a last name. Helen didn't interrupt. She stayed hidden in the shadowed hallway, her breath caught. Because in that moment, Thomas didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a boy who'd lost his compass, a man still searching for someone to explain how the world had turned so cold without permission. She could have cleared her throat, made her presence known. Instead, she stepped back silently and returned to her desk. But that image stayed with her. The power suit, the immaculate hair, the man made of numbers, looking utterly lost in front of a memory. The next day, Thomas was back to form, crisp, efficient, measured. But Helen saw the difference now. She saw the ghost in his eyes, and for reasons she couldn't quite name. She cared. She didn't know much about his past. She didn't know the battles he'd fought to earn the seat he now occupied, or the cost he'd paid to stay in it. But she recognized that kind of silence. It was the kind you carried, not the kind you created. She had lived in it, too. Sometimes, when the world won't listen, you whisper into the margins. Helen didn't plan to start writing the notes. It happened the same way autumn turns to winter quietly, and with no one watching. It was a Wednesday. Cold, damp, the kind of morning that settled deep into your bones. She'd slept poorly the night before. Dreams of her mother's voice, half-remembered recipes, and old classroom blackboards haunted the edges of her sleep. She'd spent a half-hour staring at the ceiling before getting up in the dark. At breakfast, she'd flipped open one of her old paperbacks, Emily Dickinson, a poet she used to assign to her students when the snow began to fall. Her eyes landed on a line she must have read 100 times before hope is the thing with feathers. This time, it caught her differently. Maybe because hope felt more like a ghost than a bird these days. Later that morning, while delivering a printed schedule to the executive office, She passed by Thomas's desk. The office was empty, still untouched by the bustle of day. The silence was thick, but somehow welcoming, like standing in the center of a church before service begins. Her eyes fell on the stark, glassy surface of his desk. Not a single personal photo, not even a coffee ring. She paused. Without thinking too much, she took a sticky note from her folder, wrote the line from Dickinson in neat, steady cursive, and placed it gently by his pen. No signature, no explanation, just a small whisper in a sea of numbers. Then she walked away. The next morning, she passed by again. The note was gone. She half smiled, expecting it had been tossed. But something about the act, simple, private, had settled something in her chest. She left another. This time, a quote from Thoreau. "The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it." And again, the paper disappeared. Over the next week, she kept going. Small notes, lines from poets, writers, old philosophers. Sometimes they were comforting, sometimes quietly challenging. Sometimes just gentle. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. In a world that's breaking, choose to be a seam. Not all growth is visible. She began folding them in half before placing them down, not to hide them, just to make the moment feel more deliberate. One day, she came in early for a printer issue and saw something she hadn't expected. On Thomas's desk, just beneath the corner of his blotter, were several of the notes. Flattened, pressed, lined up carefully. He hadn't thrown them away. He'd kept them. That morning, Thomas arrived 2 minutes earlier than usual. He didn't say anything to her, but as he walked past her desk, she noticed he looked up. Just briefly, their eyes met, and in that flicker of a glance, she saw it, recognition, not of who she was, but that she was. The next day, Helen chose a quote from Wendell Berry, one of her favorites. "There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places." She wondered what Thomas would think of that. If he believed places like offices could ever feel sacred, if he remembered what it meant to work somewhere that felt like home. The ritual became her quiet rebellion, a way of planting something human in the most sterile room of the building. She never spoke of it, not to Edith, not even to herself out loud. But something changed in her as the days passed. Her shoulders eased. Her voice, when she spoke in meetings, carried more steadiness. It was as if the act of offering softness into the world, even anonymously, made her more whole. One morning, she chose a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke. "Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love." She paused as she folded the note. This one felt more exposed, more personal, not just an offering of thought, but of understanding. She held it in her palm for a moment longer than usual, then tucked it gently beneath the edge of his notepad and turned to leave. But this time, the timing was off. She hadn't heard the elevator or the click of the outer door. Thomas stood just inside his office doorway, coat still on, briefcase in hand. He wasn't startled. He didn't ask what she was doing. He simply looked at her, not with accusation, not even curiosity, just a kind of quiet stillness. Helen froze. Her hand hovered an inch above his desk, the folded paper sitting where she'd just placed it. Their eyes met fully for the first time, not in passing, not in a hallway, but with nothing to deflect or distract. She straightened, lips parting slightly, but found no words to offer. He didn't fill the silence either, didn't move, didn't interrupt the moment. There was something fragile in the air, not tension, not discomfort, recognition of what even they might not have known, but something passed between them, something that didn't need to be spoken to be real. Helen offered the faintest of nods, then walked past him, quietly, with dignity intact. Thomas stood still for a long while. After, he removed his coat, sat down slowly, and picked up the folded note. He unfolded it carefully, deliberately, like something sacred. He read the words once, then again. Then he slid it into the top drawer of his desk with all the others. She had been seen, and for the first time in a very long time, so had he. Big change doesn't always start with big meetings. Sometimes it starts with a cookie. Helen had always believed in small things, not because she thought they fixed the world, but because sometimes they softened it. And soft was a word this office had long forgotten. It started with oatmeal cookies, the old-fashioned kind made with cinnamon, real butter, and a pinch of clove the way her mother used to do. She brought a small tin to work one morning. No reason, no occasion. Just a quiet instinct, a way of saying, "You're not invisible." She placed the tin in the break room beside the dusty microwave and the tired vending machine. No note, no name, just the smell. By noon, the cookies were gone. By 2 p.m. Mason passed her desk and whispered, "Those cookies were amazing," before blushing and darting away. The next week, she brought banana bread, moist, rich, sliced thin with wax paper between each piece. It disappeared too. And with it, something subtle began to shift. A thank you appeared on a sticky note left by the coffee pot. Then another, this time with a smiley face. Helen smiled to herself. And then she brought in tea. She cleaned off a small table in the far corner of the break room, right where the window caught morning light. She added a clean tablecloth, a small vase with dried lavender, and a handwritten sign. Hearth corner. Take a breath. Take a bite. Take a moment. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't need it. Some things spoke for themselves. Each week, she rotated the offerings: shortbread dipped in dark chocolate, apple slices with cinnamon, tiny jars of honey from the farmer's market, handwritten quotes tucked under the cups. She noticed people lingering longer by the table, not to talk, at least not yet, but to stand still, to sip slowly, to be present. Edith, the HR manager, started bringing her own tea bag and using the corner as a morning ritual. Frank, the warehouse driver, left behind a homemade fig jam one Thursday with a scribbled note for the bread lady. Even silence began to feel warmer. Then, one day, something new appeared at the hearth corner. A small notebook with a leather cover left open with a pen beside it. The title page said, "Gratitude. Shared is warmth multiplied. Write something if you feel moved to." Helen hadn't written that. She didn't know who had, but she smiled and let it be. The entries came slowly at first, thanks to whoever brings the snacks. You make Mondays bearable. I forgot what fresh cookies tasted like. You reminded me. My mother used to make tea like this. I haven't thought of her in years. And then a page written in small, careful handwriting to the person who made Hearth Corner. Thank you. I was starting to feel like I didn't matter here, but this little table, this tiny space, it made me feel human again. M. Helen's chest tightened as she read the initials. Mason. She sat in the empty break room that afternoon, watching the winter sun stretch through the window. She thought of all the things the office didn't have: birthday balloons, laughter, holiday songs, and yet, here, in this small forgotten corner, humanity had bloomed again, not loudly, but sincerely. The next morning, she arrived to find something unexpected. Thomas Granger was in the break room, standing alone, a mug of chamomile tea in hand. He didn't look rushed, or distracted, or superior, just thoughtful. Helen hesitated at the doorway, uncertain whether to step in or wait. He turned slightly, saw her, and gave the smallest nod, then gestured subtle, almost shyly, toward the hearth corner. "I tried the orange spice yesterday," he said, voice low, almost conversational. "Was that cardamom?" She nodded. "And a bit of nutmeg." He hummed. It was surprisingly comforting. A pause. Then he added, "Thank you." She didn't ask how he knew. Some things didn't need explaining. She refilled the honey jar as he sipped. Then he set his mug down and picked up the gratitude notebook, flipped through a few pages. When he reached Mason's note, he stopped. His eyes lingered. He read the page once, then again, and then he closed the notebook gently. He didn't say a word, but he didn't throw it away either. Helen watched him leave the room, his shoulders a little less square than before. In his silence, she heard something different this time. Not distance, not dismissal, but consideration. The hearth corner stayed. It became more than a table. It became a heartbeat. "Some people speak loudly," Helen whispered, and still. He heard her. No one announced that Thomas Granger was changing. It wasn't in an email blast. There was no all-staff meeting, no mission statement revision taped to the break-room fridge. But the office felt different. Not suddenly, not loudly, but like early spring pushing gently at the edges of winter. The first clue came on a Friday morning. Helen walked in early, as she often did, arms full of lemon scones and a small thermos of peppermint tea. The hearth corner was quiet, basking in the soft light of sunrise. She was halfway through arranging the napkins when she noticed something new, a box of ceramic mugs, simple, white, but new, and a printed sign beside them. "Real tea deserves real mugs. Management." She stared at it for a moment, blinking. Not a big gesture, not flashy, but a step, a real one. A week later, during their regular Monday check-in. Thomas paused mid-sentence to ask Frank about his son's high school graduation. Frank nearly choked on his coffee. Not because the question was invasive, but because no CEO had ever asked about his family, let alone remembered. In the following days, the changes continued, quiet but intentional. Birthday emails began arriving from the HR account again, this time with a small personal message included for each employee. A dozen balloons quietly appeared in Mason's cubicle on his birthday, along with a card signed simply, "We see you, happy birthday." And Thomas, who once walked the halls like a shadow of pressure, began to slow down. He didn't rush past people anymore. He lingered, offered soft nods, made eye contact, even smiled awkwardly at first, like someone trying on an old coat that almost fit. But through it all, he never acknowledged Helen, not directly. Not a word about the hearth corner, not a mention of the quotes, not a glance at the growing gratitude journal, now filled with dozens of anonymous thank yous. It was as if nothing had changed between them. And yet, everything had. Helen didn't need the credit. She never had. Her joy came in watching the space come alive again, watching Edith hum softly while making tea, watching two marketing interns giggle over shortbread and argue about whether the lavender cookies were better than the orange zest ones, watching Mason begin to stand straighter, walk with more confidence, start conversations. Healing wasn't always a miracle. Sometimes it was just a warm corner and someone remembering your name. Then came the quarterly leadership meeting. It was held in the large glass conference room overlooking the snowy courtyard, a long table, dozens of chairs, laptops open, coffee cups lined up like soldiers. Helen took her usual seat near the back, tasked with note-taking. She had come to expect charts, metrics, bullet points, and occasional tension. Thomas stood at the head of the table, pointer in hand, running through the slides. He spoke clearly, directly, his usual confident tone returning when talking strategy. This quarter's big initiative mentorship, a pairing system for senior staff to guide new hires. Mason's name appeared on one of the slides, listed as a pilot candidate. As Thomas spoke, Helen found herself admiring not the content, but the delivery. He didn't sound like someone reading lines. He sounded like someone who believed in them. Then it happened. While explaining the purpose of mentorship, he paused, looked up at the room, and said, "People aren't just assets. They're roots. You grow a company by nourishing them." Silence. Not the kind of pause waiting for a reaction, but the kind of silence that follows something honest, something human. Helen froze. The words. She had written them 2 months ago, folded inside a quote from Wendell Berry and left on his desk on a rainy Thursday. She remembered the ink smudging slightly from her hand. She remembered doubting whether it mattered. Now, those exact words were floating in a glass room, spoken in Thomas Granger's voice. He blinked, as if realizing something had slipped. There was a slight shift in his jaw. His hands tensed around the laser pointer, but he didn't backtrack. He didn't explain. He simply clicked to the next slide and continued. The room remained quiet a few seconds longer than usual. Something had changed in the air. People weren't just listening. They were feeling. Helen lowered her gaze, then glanced sideways. No one looked at her, and that was fine. But in her chest, something fluttered. A bird, maybe, or hope with feathers. She smiled, not widely, not for show, just enough. Because she didn't need acknowledgement. She didn't need his eyes to find hers across the room. She had been heard, and somehow he'd kept listening. Some betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from those who fear change the most. It started with a subject line. Concerns about ethics and influence. Urgent. No name. No sender. Just a rooted email, dropped like a stone in the inboxes of every board member at Granger & Sons. And Thomas, of course. Thomas. The message was sharp, deliberate. It accused him of favoritism, of allowing a junior administrative hire to manipulate company culture for personal influence, of letting sentiment cloud judgment, and of creating an emotional dependence on non-business initiatives. It didn't name Helen outright, but it didn't have to. The board reacted quickly, too quickly. Change had come to the company. Yes, but not everyone welcomed it. Some saw Hearth Corner not as healing, but as threat. Some viewed warmth as weakness and kindness as chaos in disguise. A closed-door session was called. Thomas stood in front of a semicircle of folded arms and measured frowns. "We're concerned," one member said, voice clipped. "Your role here is CEO, not emotional liaison. The culture shift is appreciated, but boundaries must be reinforced. You've allowed one employee too much influence. It's setting precedent. And finally, this is not about her. Thomas, this is about you. You can either restore the structure or step down from it." He said nothing at first, not because he didn't have words, but because the only ones that came felt too human for a room built on control. Helen didn't hear about the meeting until the next day, but by then, she already felt the change in the air. Doors closed more quickly. Conversations hushed as she walked by. The warmth she'd so carefully nurtured had begun to flicker. It didn't take much to guess the shape of the storm. Later that afternoon, Thomas called her into his office. He didn't meet her eyes when she entered. He simply gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and when she sat, he said quietly, "I'm sorry." That was all. No explanation, no defense, just 2 words, heavy as lead. She didn't ask for more. Her eyes scanned the room one last time, the books she'd stacked neatly in the window corner, the tea jar she'd refilled yesterday, the tiny plant someone had left beside her keyboard weeks ago, now thriving. She nodded, then stood up. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She gathered her things, a small box, a folder of handwritten notes, the last of the chamomile, and walked through the hallway she'd once transformed with light. People watched her go. Some stood. Some didn't know what to do with their hands. Mason looked down, then back up again. His eyes were glassy, his jaw clenched. She smiled at him, that soft, steady smile she'd always had, and walked through the front door without a sound. Thomas watched from the window upstairs, and for the first time in his life, his entire life, he felt powerless. Not because he'd lost control, but because, for once, he knew what it meant to lose something that mattered. That night, he stayed in the office long after the lights were off. The building creaked in its sleep. The wind tapped against the old windows. He sat at his desk, the inbox still open, the anonymous email still glowing like a wound. But he didn't read it again. Instead, he opened the drawer, the one on the right, the one he never let anyone touch. Inside was a stack of folded notes, worn, soft-edged from being opened and reread too many times. He laid them out across his desk, carefully, reverently, one by one, each quote, each sentence, each small reminder that someone once believed he could be more than numbers. He read them all again, not quickly, but slowly, letting them pierce through the armor he'd worn for decades. Words that once felt poetic now felt like mirrors. Perhaps everything that frightens us is something helpless that wants our love. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the last one. The Rilke quote, the one he had caught her placing, the day they had first truly seen each other. His throat tightened. The ache wasn't sharp, it was low, old, like a door finally creaking open after years of rust. He laid his head in his hands, and for the first time in years, he didn't think about profit margins or quarterly growth. He thought about how quiet the office felt now, how cold, how utterly empty. She was gone, and only now did he understand what she had really brought with her. Not tea, not cookies, not birthday cards, but presence, grace, and a kind of hope that didn't demand attention, but transformed everything it touched. The wind outside pressed harder, a storm coming. But inside, the only sound was paper shifting as he breathed. His heart finally broke open. You don't know who you are until the moment you must choose who to protect. Thomas Granger had faced difficult meetings before. He'd stood before investors during economic downturns. He'd defended budget cuts, mergers, even warehouse closings, but never had his hands trembled like they did this morning. Never had he felt the stakes so personal. The boardroom was quiet when he entered. Heavy curtains muted the morning light. A long, polished table separated him from 8 faces, some skeptical, some disappointed, a few unreadable. At the far end sat Leonard Haynes, his grandfather's oldest advisor, the man who had mentored him, toasted his promotion, and whispered warnings when he tried to bring change. Now, the man who had betrayed him. Thomas didn't need proof beyond the tone of the anonymous email. It had Leonard's fingerprints all over it, formal, controlled, passive-aggressive in all the right ways. She's becoming a distraction. Culture change must be strategic, not sentimental. Favoritism erodes credibility. The board chair cleared her throat. Mr. Granger, we've reviewed the concerns raised about your conduct. While we appreciate innovation, the nature of your relationship with Ms. Whitaker has raised questions about boundaries and leadership focus. A pause. This meeting is your opportunity to address those questions. Thomas said nothing at first. He sat, spine straight, fingers folded neatly, then, without a word, reached into his folder and pulled out a single page folded, worn, handwritten, Helen's letter. He unfolded it gently, then began to read aloud, voice even but soft. Dear Mr. Granger, you don't know me, but I feel like I've come to know you through the walls of this building, through the way people still speak your name like it meant something bigger than business. You built something here, not just a company, but a community. I hope you'd be proud of what it's becoming again. He paused. The room was still. Even Leonard leaned forward slightly. I don't know if I belong here, but I've tried, in small ways, to bring a little light back into this place. A quote here. A warm cup there. Maybe it's silly, but I believe people remember how a place made them feel long after they forget the numbers. Thomas's voice caught slightly just for a moment. Then he folded the letter back up, pressed it flat with his palm, and looked directly at the board. That's the kind of voice we silenced for too long. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You're asking me if I crossed a line. But I think you're asking the wrong question. You should be asking why someone like her was the first person to make this place feel human again. The room shifted. Some leaned back. Others glanced at one another. Still, no one interrupted. Yes, Helen Whitaker changed the culture here. Yes, she left sticky notes on my desk and served tea in real mugs. And, because of her, birthdays returned. People laughed in hallways. Our intern stopped flinching every time someone spoke to him. His eyes flicked briefly to Leonard. That's not manipulation. That's leadership. Not the kind you can measure in quarterly reports, but the kind my grandfather understood, the kind we lost. He rose from his chair. If doing what's right for this company means punishing someone who reminded us how to care, then I won't do it. And if keeping my title means letting go of the one person who made me more than a CEO, then you can have it back. The air seemed to hold its breath. Someone exhaled, slowly. A paper rustled at the far end of the table. Leonard cleared his throat. Thomas, sentiment is not strategy. Thomas met his eyes. No, but strategy without sentiment is just control in a suit. The board chair looked down, then up again. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, softly she said, You're your grandfather's grandson, after all. She turned slightly to the others, and then she clapped, once, twice, slow, measured. Others followed, not all, but enough. Thomas didn't smile, but his jaw unclenched, his shoulders eased. He sat down not victorious, but clear. For once, he hadn't made the choice that protected power. He had chosen truth. And somewhere, in a quiet home across town, a woman who once believed she was easy to forget was about to find out how deeply she had been remembered. A year can change a company. A moment can change a man. 1 year later, spring arrived early in Vermont. The kind of spring that didn't knock, just walked in, opened the windows, and let warmth spill into forgotten corners. At Granger and Sons Foods, something else had opened too. Not just the windows, not just the air, but the people. Helen Whitaker walked through the glass doors with a badge that now read Director of Culture and Community. No longer a secretary, no longer invisible, no longer afraid. She wore soft blue, carried a fresh tin of lemon shortbread, and smiled at Mason, who was stringing handmade banners across the main hall. Gratitude Week, they called it now. The hearth corner still stood, but it wasn't just a corner anymore. It had multiplied. Each floor had its own tea carts, cookie jars, chalkboards with handwritten affirmations. Even the factory floor had one tucked near the supply rack, with a crate of granola bars and a sign that read, "You are not just part of the machine. You keep it running. Helen didn't create all of it." She just started the ripple. Now the company pulsed with small acts of humanity. Frank, the warehouse driver, had started leaving jars of his homemade jam, each labeled with a joke and a smiley face. Mason now ran onboarding sessions for new interns, greeting them with mugs that said, "You belong here." Edith, long since retired, still visited once a month to host a staff poetry reading, complete with peppermint tea and folding chairs. Helen moved through the halls like sunlight. She didn't rush. She didn't direct. She simply noticed. A broken chair, a tired glance, a quiet whin, and people noticed her noticing. Upstairs, Thomas Granger stood behind the glass railing overlooking the main floor. He wore a slate-gray blazer, no tie. His shoulders were looser now, like a man who no longer carried his name like a burden. In his pocket was a small velvet box. It had lived there for days. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. But it was there, waiting. He watched as Helen leaned over to help Mason hang a banner that wouldn't stay taped. She laughed when the string fell. Mason laughed harder, and Thomas smiled. Not because it was funny, but because she was smiling. He remembered the first time he'd seen her, not truly, but seen her. How she placed those quiet quotes on his desk. How she baked warmth into every crumb. How she whispered change into a company that had long forgotten how to feel. She'd once written a letter to his grandfather, a letter she never meant him to find, but he did, and he kept it, folded in his wallet like a compass. People remember how a place made them feel long after they forget the numbers. He remembered, and he never wanted to forget again. The culture metrics had changed. Employee satisfaction was up. Turnover was down. But those numbers weren't what made him proud. What made him proud was the sound of someone singing in the break room. The smell of fresh bread from the intern's birthday breakfast. The way people lingered in doorways now, just to say hello. Thomas walked down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, as if grounding himself. He reached the hearth corner, now upgraded with a patchwork quilt over the bench and a tiny vase of daisies. Helen turned when she saw him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Too many cookies?" she asked playfully. "Not possible," he said. He looked around. "You did all this." She shrugged. "We all did." He nodded, then reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the velvet. Not yet, he told himself. Soon. They sat for a moment, side by side, sipping chamomile from mismatched mugs. Outside, wind rustled the new leaves. Inside, something in him settled, not ended, just arrived. He had waited long enough. He had built a company on rules, but for her, he broke every one. The sun poured through the west windows of Granger and Sons, painting gold onto the walls, onto the chairs, onto the faces of the people who had stayed late, not out of obligation, but out of something else entirely. Gratitude, pride, belonging. It was Founders' Day, a tradition revived after nearly a decade of neglect. The air smelled of cinnamon and citrus. Someone had made cider. There were cupcakes and laughter. The conference room, once cold and silent, had been transformed into a gathering space lit by string lights and framed photographs from the company's history. At the center of it all stood a small wooden podium. And at that podium, Helen. She wore soft gray, her hair pinned up, a simple chain at her neck. There was no script in her hands, only a folded paper in her pocket, and a heart still learning how to beat in full color. She looked out at the room faces she had come to love. Mason near the front, wiping his glasses. Frank by the food table, already on his second cider. Edith in the second row, proudly clutching a hand-knit scarf and blinking away tears. And Thomas, standing at the back, still, but fully present. Helen cleared her throat, smiled gently. This company has changed in the past year. We've celebrated birthdays, shared poems, cried a little, laughed a lot. Laughter rose warm and familiar. But more than that, we've remembered that work is not just what we do. It's who we do it with. It's how we make people feel along the way. She paused. And if I've learned anything here, it's that even in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely people, kindness still finds a way. Applause swelled, not thunderous, but sincere. She stepped back from the podium, eyes catching Thomas's for only a moment. Then she turned to leave the stage. But Thomas stepped forward. He didn't say a word at first. He simply walked up to the podium as the room hushed again. The golden light framed him from behind, spilling around his shoulders like something symbolic but unspoken. He rested his hands on the wooden edges, looked at no one, then looked directly at Helen. I used to believe leadership meant staying the course, following the data, keeping emotions separate. A small murmur, some smiles. Everyone knew the old Thomas. But someone once wrote to my grandfather that people remember how a place made them feel, long after they forget the numbers. He turned slightly. Helen Whitaker, you made us feel again. He stepped away from the podium, walked toward her. The room seemed to hold its breath. You didn't just change this company. You changed me. He reached into his pocket, black velvet, a simple box. He opened it, not slowly, not for effect, but gently, like something sacred. Inside a ring, not large, not flashy, but classic, meaningful. Will you keep changing everything so by being my wife? A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Mason's hands flew to his mouth. Edith dabbed her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan, but Helen, she didn't cry. Not at first. She looked at him, eyes shimmering, face unreadable for just a second. And then she nodded, not wildly, not with a dramatic leap, just once, deep, true. Thomas exhaled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and in that moment, nothing else existed. Not titles, not board meetings, not the ghost of failure. Only this two people who had found each other through tea, silence, and courage. The room erupted, cheers, applause, laughter breaking like sunlight across years of frost. Mason hugged Edith. Frank fist-pumped the air. Someone popped a balloon by accident, and everyone jumped, then laughed harder. And Helen stood there, hand in Thomas's, heart full. There were no cameras, no press, no headlines, just people, together, witnessing something real. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last of the cider was poured, Helen leaned close to Thomas and whispered, "Was this your plan all along?" He smiled. "You changed the plan." They stood near the window, watching the light turn to amber, and behind them, the hearth corner flickered gently now, a permanent part of the company, with a framed quote on the wall that read, "Be kind, always." It's the only thing people never forget. Because in the end, not every love story begins with a kiss. Some begin with a note left on a CEO's desk, a cookie, a quote, a question, and a heart finally willing to say, yes. Sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest truth. In a world obsessed with efficiency, titles, and numbers, it's easy to forget the power of presence, of kindness, of gentleness, of simply noticing another human being. Helen didn't shout to be heard. She whispered into the silence. And still, she changed everything. This story reminds us that we are never too old, too late, or too invisible to make a difference. The smallest gestures, a handwritten note, a warm drink, a genuine smile can reach farther than strategy or status ever will. And perhaps the greatest transformation doesn't come from top-down leadership, but from the courage to care, especially when it's not expected and not easy. As we grow older, we often look back, wondering what truly mattered. This story is a quiet answer. It's not the promotions, the profit, or the power. It's the people. It always has been. So today, whether in a workplace or at home, choose to be someone's warmth, even if the world has gone cold. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, made you reflect, or simply warmed your day, please consider giving it a like, sharing it with someone you care about, and subscribing to our channel. Every story we tell is made for you. And every click of support helps us keep sharing light, one story at a time.